Welcome to another session of our EpiDoc training program, for which you can see a link at the bottom of the screen. And in this session, Gabriel Bodard of the University of London is going to talk about how to encode verse in EpiDoc. So please, Gabby.
Thank you, Irene. So yes, the interesting thing about marking up verse is, of course, the potential for encoding and exploiting the metrical content of these texts. This is particularly interesting for verse inscriptions, as you'll see in the examples I show, but any kind of primary text or documentary text which has verse content, you can use this sort of encoding for. The first example I want to illustrate here is using this couplet. It's 2 lines of verse, which is this edition of it is taken from an inscription. The inscription is written across 6 lines, not just the 2 lines of verse, and you can see the line divisions that would normally be represented by new lines in an epigraphic edition, with these little vertical bars here in the middle of the text. So the first line reads albino vi, and the second line begins lo patrin, etc. The layout of the text, this is not just centered, although it looks like it. This is that the second line has been indented because it is it's pentameter, the second line, because this is elegiac, or alternate hexameter and pentameter lines. So that's that's what's being represented in this edition. So unlike usual epigraphic editions, we're showing the semantic structure of the text rather than the layout of it on the stone in this case. However, the first thing to think about when you're encoding this in EpiDoc is the epigraphic encoding of this. How would you mark this up if it were an inscription with no verse features or any other features that you're interested in? And what you would do is you would mark up each line on the stone. The whole text would be in this anonymous block. Each line on the stone would have an LB. This is where the line begins. LB means this is where an epigraphic line begins, or papyrological line, but a line on the support. And where a line begins in the middle of a word, as here in philopatrin, in the example we just looked at, you say break equals no, to represent the fact that there are no spaces around that vertical bar up there, unlike this vertical bar, which is in between 2 words. Okay, and so that doesn't have break equals no on there. So far, we're marking that up exactly as we would an inscription. Okay, that markup is unchanged. What changes is this is no longer an arbitrary block of text. This is specifically a block of verse text. So we'll use slightly different markup at that level, but all the content will remain completely unchanged. What we will do is we will say this span of text, these 2 lines, or these 6 lines on the stone, is one line group. LG is the tag for line group, which can be used to mean a stanza or something similar, a group of verse texts. And each verse line is encoded using this element L. So unlike LB, which is an empty element and marks the beginning of a line, and it's the beginning of the physical line on the support, L represents a conceptual line of verse, which may or may not be printed in a single line on your support. And just as we've numbered the physical lines on the stone 1 to 6, we can also number the lines of verse 1 and 2. And the fact that this N1 and this N1 are on different elements means that you shouldn't confuse them between each other. One is specifically the first physical line, the other is the first verse line on there. So far, we've changed nothing in the underlying epigraphic markup. We've just changed the structural block that contains this encoding, and that's very much how we would expect to continue. As epigraphers or papyrologists, we would like to be able to go back to, from this encoding, the physical layout of the object, of the text on the object, at all times, no matter how much semantic and other literary information we've also added to the encoding. So having done this, there's various other information we could, if we chose, add to this encoding. One is we could say the meter of this block, so this line group, and you see here I've just I've simplified, because it's going to start filling up the page with markup. I've simplified the layout by hiding the numbers of the physical line breaks and putting them all on a single line. That hasn't changed the underlying markup at all. I've just done that for simplicity, for us to be able to see the encoding that I'm adding now. So we can say this LG, in addition to saying this is some block, some group of verse lines, we can also say that the meter of this group, the conceptual meter of this group of lines, is elegiac, and this is simply this element, this attribute met, and free text content. We just say how we would describe that meter. We can also go further if we decide this is something valuable for our encoding, for our project, and tag the conceptual meter of each individual line, verse line as well. We can say the first line of verse is hexameter, the second line of verse is pentameter. In some projects that I've worked on, which have a number of verse inscriptions in, this encoding, the met equals pentameter, is what enables us to indent the second line of the text by saying pentameter lines in a block of elegiac verse should be indented by a certain amount. Okay, so that's one reason you might want to encode that. You might also want to encode that if you're doing metrical analysis or something, or you would like your text to be available for people in the future to do metrical analysis on these texts. Having encoded in this way is something that's valuable. But as always, you do need to think what you want to encode and why, and whether it's worth the additional effort for encoding additional information. The third piece of information you might want to add to this piece of verse is additionally to the conceptual meter of the entire text and of the individual lines, is the realization of that meter. So hexameter, as you know, represents the idea that each foot, each of the 6 feet in the line has a dactylic form, which is represented by either one long syllable followed by 2 short syllables, or 2 long syllables, or in final position it can be a long followed by a short followed by a rest. But either of those are other common features. In practice, that line may be realized in therefore 30 or so different ways if you do the math as to how many possibilities there are. So we are, in this case, we're using a convention, and this is a fairly standard convention, but it's not absolutely the only convention. You could come up with your own convention if you wanted, but a fairly standard convention is to use the plus sign for a long syllable and the minus sign for a short syllable. It's slightly unintuitive at first glance, but so here we're saying that the first foot is a spondian, the second foot is a dactyl, and the third and the fourth and the fifth, and it ends with a spondian. That's fairly common. Okay, so this is scanning that line as opposed to saying it's hexameter. Okay, so met is saying in principle this line contains, and real says the actual scansion of this line is. And likewise for this line of pentameter, you can encode that there. And if you wanted to, you could also encode rests and caesura and similar things to that in the thing with other symbols if you wanted to add those in there as well. That, I think, is basically what we have to say about encoding these 2 lines of verse or 6 lines of inscription using metrical encoding. Is there anything you think I should add to that, Irene, before I move on to the second example?
No, I think it's fine. Okay,
great, thank you. Okay, so my second example then is what do we do if we want to encode this line of inscription, which we know is a line of verse. We have no idea what is in this lacuna at the beginning of the line, but because it's a line of verse, we know its meter. Okay, and so that would sometimes be represented in the epigraphic edition, something like this. So we know that it's the rest of the line, but we just don't know what the words are. In this case, we again start with the same principle as we started with the first example. We encode exactly what we would if it were not a verse inscription. We say this is a gap, reason lost, quantity approximately 9 characters, and then we encode the rest of the line. And I've not encoded the whole of the line there. You'll notice I've left underdots in the line rather than putting them marking them as unclear. But just to save a space, that's the sort of that's the basic encoding we do on this text is we encode the gap, and we don't say, you know, quantity 5 unit syllables or quantity, you know, 1.6 unit equals feet or anything like that. We mark up the gap is a gap of, you know, an approximate number of characters or a number of centimeters or however you measure gaps on the stone. The semantic information about its meter is something we add as a separate layer to that. And what we do that is we use this element seg, which is just saying this is a segment of the text, an arbitrary segment of the text, and we give again this met attribute. So we're not talking about the realization of the meter of that lacuna, because we don't know the exact meter of the exact scansion of the lacuna, but we know its metrical shape is long, too short, long, short. Okay, that could have originally been realized by, you know, 2 longs and then a long and a short, but this is the general shape of it. So this is the metrical pattern in principle of that, and this can be used to generate either a relatively diplomatic view of the text where we see, you know, just see the square brackets with dash circa 9 inside, saying that there's roughly 9 characters missing, or to represent this this slightly more literary view that we saw in this example, with the meter represented in the encoding, in the addition within the square brackets there. So those are the 2 main things you might be interested in if you're encoding meter in EpiDoc. There is, of course, more, and on the page on meter in the EpiDoc guidelines, we'll have a few more examples of the sort of thing that can be done. And if you're interested in encoding things like caesura and other metrical features, then, you know, there are things, there's precedent from other projects that you might be interested in looking at, even if you decide ultimately to do it in a slightly different way. But this is the general shape. Anything you'd add to that, Irene? Anything you remember from?
Again, everything fine.
Okay, great. Thank you then.